My parents forced me into experimental drug trials to fund my brother's cancer treatment. Now my brother's gone and I have permanent organ damage. I take 17 pills every morning just to keep my kidneys functioning at 30% capacity. My liver is so scarred that alcohol would probably kill me, not that I can afford to find out. I'm 26 years old, and I've already been on a transplant waiting list for 2 years. The irony isn't lost on me that I spent my childhood as a human test subject so my brother could live, and now I'm the one waiting for organs. But Ethan died anyway when he was 15 and I was 13, so I guess we both lost. Except I'm still here, swallowing pills that cost more than my rent, living with the consequences of decisions I never made. My parents made 6 figures off my body over 7 years. They spent it on experimental treatments for Ethan that insurance wouldn't cover, on trips to specialists in other countries, on alternative therapies that promised miracles, and on themselves, new cars, home renovations, a boat. Yeah, a boat. While I was in Phase 1, trials for drugs that hadn't been tested on humans yet, my dad bought a fishing boat because he needed to relax from the stress. I didn't understand what was happening when it started. I was 6 years old. Ethan had just been diagnosed with neuroblastoma, a cancer that mostly hits kids. He was 8. One day we were playing video games in his room, and the next day he was in the hospital getting scans and biopsies and chemo. Our lives changed overnight. My mom quit her job to take care of him. My dad's insurance covered some of the treatment, but not the cutting-edge stuff, not the experimental protocols that might actually save Ethan's life. That's when my parents discovered that pharmaceutical companies pay for clinical trial participants. Not just pay, but pay well, especially for pediatric trials since it's harder to recruit kids. They started searching for trials I could join. Healthy children were actually more valuable than sick ones for certain types of studies. They needed baseline data, control groups, safety testing on developing bodies. I was perfect, young, healthy, and my parents were desperate enough to sign anything. The first trial was for an allergy medication. It seemed harmless enough, or at least that's what I told myself years later when I was trying to understand how it all started. Twice a week after school, my mom would drive me to a research facility about 40 minutes from our house. It was in a newer office building with a waiting room that had toys and a TV playing cartoons. They'd take my blood pressure and temperature, ask me questions about how I felt, then give me a little cup with a pill in it. Sometimes it was pink, sometimes white. I never knew which was the real drug and which was the placebo. They told me I might get a stuffy nose or feel tired. The compensation was $3,000 for a 3-month study. My parents signed the consent forms and deposited the checks. I got to pick out a toy from the dollar store afterward if I didn't cry when they drew blood. That was my payment. A $3 action figure for helping fund my brother's cancer treatment. Not that I understood that's what was happening. Ethan's treatment was brutal. He lost his hair within weeks. He couldn't keep food down. He missed months of school. I remember sitting in his hospital room doing homework while he slept, watching the poison drip into his veins through an IV, hoping it was killing the cancer faster than it was killing him. My parents were constantly stressed about money. Even with insurance, the copays and deductibles were crushing. The experimental treatments they wanted to try weren't covered at all. One therapy cost $40,000 per round, and Ethan needed multiple rounds. My dad took a second job working nights at a warehouse. My mom was always on the phone with billing departments, insurance companies, and pharmaceutical companies running clinical trials. I heard her in the kitchen late at night, crying about numbers I couldn't comprehend. And then she'd come to my room, turn on the light, and tell me about a new trial she'd found. This one paid $5,000. That one paid $7,000. Would I be willing to help my brother? Would I be a good kid and do this for our family? What was I supposed to say? No? I was 7 years old watching my brother die. Of course I said yes. Of course I wanted to help. I didn't understand what I was agreeing to. The trials got more intensive. An asthma medication that made my heart race and my hands shake. A pain reliever that gave me splitting headaches, which seems counterproductive in retrospect. A gastrointestinal drug that had me throwing up so violently, I thought I'd turn inside out. But the checks got bigger. $10,000 for a 6-month trial. $15,000 for one that required weekend hospital stays. My parents kept signing me up. They'd find trials through online databases, through doctors who knew doctors, through word of mouth in the pediatric oncology community. Other parents of sick kids would share information about which pharmaceutical companies paid the most, which research facilities had the shortest wait lists. There was this whole underground network of desperate families selling their healthy children's bodies to science to afford the care their sick children needed, and the pharmaceutical companies were happy to take advantage. By the time I was 9, I'd been in 12 different clinical trials. I missed school constantly for appointments and monitoring visits. I had a medical file thicker than most adults. The research coordinators knew me by name. Some of them seemed uncomfortable with how often they saw me, how many studies I was enrolled in simultaneously. The regulations said you couldn't be in multiple trials at once, but my parents would lie on the screening questionnaires. They'd take me to facilities in different cities where the records didn't connect. They'd use slight variations of my name. Daniel on one consent form, Dan on another, Danny on a third. The money was too good to stop, and Ethan was still sick. His cancer went into remission once, for about 8 months when I was 10. We had a birthday party for him, a real one with kids from his class, and a cake shaped like a football. He looked almost normal that day, his hair growing back, his color better. I remember thinking maybe it was over. Maybe all the trials, all the blood draws and side effects and hospital visits had been worth it. 2 months later, the cancer came back. The second round was worse. The tumors were more aggressive this time, resistant to the treatments that had worked before. The doctors said his best shot was an experimental protocol at a research hospital in Houston. We lived in Ohio. The treatment would cost over $200,000 and require Ethan to stay in Texas for at least 6 months. Insurance wouldn't touch it. My parents mortgaged the house, maxed out credit cards, and found more trials for me. These were different, though. Not just medication studies for common ailments, but early-phase trials for drugs that had barely been tested. Phase 1 trials, where they're mostly trying to figure out if the drug will kill you, not if it will help you. The money was substantial. $20,000 for a 3-month Phase 1 oncology drug trial, and yes, they were testing cancer drugs on healthy children to see what the side effects would be. $30,000 for a neurological medication that required spinal taps. $40,000 for a trial so experimental that I had to sign a waiver acknowledging there was no animal testing data available. I was 11 years old signing documents I couldn't read, much less understand, because my parents told me to. My mom would put the pen in my hand, guide it to the signature line, and tell me this was how we'd save Ethan. The money from these trials funded his treatment in Houston. My dad drove him down there and stayed with him while my mom stayed in Ohio with me, shuttling me between research facilities like it was her full-time job, because it was. This was how our family survived. I was the cash cow, and Ethan was the money pit, and my parents were the ones keeping the whole terrible system running. I started having side effects that wouldn't go away, constant fatigue that made it hard to stay awake in class, nausea that came and went without warning, weird rashes that would appear on my arms and legs, angry red welts that itched and burned. The research doctors would note these effects in my charts, adjust dosages, sometimes pull me from a study early, but there was always another trial, another consent form, another check. One trial in particular, I'll never forget. I was 12. It was for an immunosuppressant drug designed to prevent organ rejection in transplant patients. The pharmaceutical company was trying to prove it was safe for children. The trial required twice-weekly injections and daily blood draws for 4 months. The compensation was $55,000, the most I'd ever been offered. My mom's eyes lit up when she read the offer letter. Ethan's treatment in Houston was working, but slowly. He needed more time, more rounds of therapy, more money. I remember sitting in the research facility's consultation room while a doctor explained the potential side effects: increased infection risk, possible kidney damage, liver complications, bone marrow suppression. My mom kept nodding like she understood, but I saw her face. She wasn't weighing the risks against my well-being. She was calculating if $55,000 was enough to cover the next phase of Ethan's treatment. It was. She signed the consent form. I got the first injection that same day. It burned going in, a thick liquid that felt like it was crawling under my skin. Within 3 weeks, I was sick constantly. Every cold that went around my school hit me twice as hard. I developed pneumonia and had to be hospitalized for 5 days. The trial was supposed to suppress my immune system, so the doctors said this was expected, within normal parameters. They didn't pause the study. My mom brought me my medications in the hospital, made sure I took them on schedule, documented my symptoms in the logbook the researchers provided. When I was discharged, we went straight to my next monitoring appointment. My blood work showed my kidney function was declining. Not drastically, the doctor said, just something to watch. They reduced my dose slightly and continued the trial. The money had already been paid out in installments. We were locked in. I remember lying in my bed at night feeling like my whole body was wrong, like I was rotting from the inside. My skin looked gray. I'd lost weight because I couldn't keep food down. My hair was falling out in clumps, which was somehow the worst part, because it made me look like Ethan during chemo. Ethan came home from Houston after 7 months of treatment. The experimental protocol had worked. His scans were clear. The doctors used words like remarkable response and complete remission. My parents cried with relief. We had a welcome home party with our extended family. Everyone kept saying it was a miracle, that God had answered our prayers. My Uncle Gary pulled me aside during the party and asked if I was feeling okay. I looked sick, he said. Really sick. I told him I was fine, just tired from a growth spurt or something. He didn't look convinced, but he didn't push it. Later I heard him arguing with my dad in the garage. I couldn't make out all the words, but I heard too many trials, and look at him, and my dad's angry response about doing what he had to do. Uncle Gary left the party early. We didn't see him much after that. My parents said he didn't understand what it took to save a child's life, that he didn't have kids, so he couldn't judge their decisions. But I think he knew. I think he saw what they were doing to me, and couldn't watch anymore. The immunosuppressant trial ended when I was almost 13. My kidney function had dropped to 60% of normal. My liver enzymes were elevated. The research team documented these findings, noted that the adverse effects were within acceptable ranges for a Phase 2 trial, and closed out my file. They paid the final installment. My parents thanked them for the opportunity. I was examined by our regular pediatrician afterward for a required checkup. Dr. Monroe had been our family doctor since I was born. He reviewed my labs with a deepening frown, then asked my parents to step out of the room. When we were alone, he asked me directly how many clinical trials I'd been in. I didn't know the exact number anymore. A lot, I said. He asked if anyone had explained the cumulative risks to me. I didn't know what cumulative meant. He explained that each trial by itself might be relatively safe, but doing many trials back to back, especially with drugs that affected the immune system and organs, could cause compounding damage. He said my body was showing signs of stress that weren't normal for a child my age. Dr. Monroe called my parents back in and told them I needed to stop participating in trials. My organs needed time to recover. My immune system needed to rebuild. He was serious, almost angry, which I'd never seen from him before. My parents nodded and agreed, but I could see my mom's jaw tighten. We left his office, and she spent the drive home telling me that Dr. Monroe didn't understand our situation, that he didn't know what it cost to save Ethan's life, that we'd take a break, but just a short one. Ethan's remission needed to be maintained. There would be more scans, more appointments, more costs. We couldn't stop now. 2 weeks later, she'd found a new trial. This one was through a facility 3 hours away, too far for Dr. Monroe to find out about. It was a cardiovascular drug meant to lower blood pressure. The trial needed adolescent participants. The payment was $35,000. My mom said this would be the last one, that Ethan was doing well, and we just needed a cushion for emergency costs. I was so tired. Tired of fighting, tired of saying no when my brother's life hung in the balance. I said yes. The cardiovascular trial was 6 months long. The drug made my heart do weird things. Sometimes it would race for no reason, pounding so hard I thought it would burst through my chest. Other times it would slow down until I felt dizzy and faint. I passed out twice at school. The nurse called my parents both times. My mom told her I was anemic and we were working with our doctor on it. She wasn't wrong about the anemia. My blood counts had been low for months, but she knew why. After the second fainting episode, the school insisted on a medical clearance before I could return. My parents took me to a different doctor, not Dr. Monroe, someone in the next town who didn't know our history. They told him I'd had a virus and just needed a note saying I was recovered. He complied without running any tests. I went back to school with my heart still doing backflips and a medical clearance letter that meant nothing. The trial continued. The checks cleared. Ethan stayed in remission. I was 14 when everything started falling apart. Not with Ethan, with me. I'd finished the cardiovascular trial and moved into another one, this time for a medication designed to treat ADHD. It was supposed to be simple, low risk, just stimulant medications that had been on the market for years but needed pediatric data for a new formulation. The trial was only 3 months and paid $20,000. Easy money, my mom said, except my body was done. Within a week of starting the medication, I developed severe abdominal pain. Not the usual nausea I'd learned to live with, but sharp stabbing pain that doubled me over. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. My mom thought it was a stomach bug and told me to tough it out. The pain got worse. On day 9 of the trial, I collapsed in the bathroom, vomiting blood. My dad found me unconscious on the tile floor and finally, took me to the emergency room. The ER doctors ran tests and scans. They found that my liver was severely inflamed, my kidneys were failing, and I had bleeding in my gastrointestinal tract. They admitted me immediately to the ICU. Specialists were called in. My parents were questioned about my medical history, and they had to come clean about the trials. All of them. The stack of consent forms and research files they'd kept in a filing cabinet at home was brought to the hospital. The doctors were horrified. They couldn't believe the volume of experimental drugs I'd been exposed to, the lack of coordination between studies, the clear signs of cumulative toxicity that had been ignored. One nephrologist, Dr. Chen Wait, I need to use a different name, Dr. Brennan, the kidney specialist, asked my parents directly what they'd been thinking. My mother's answer was simple. We were saving our other son. Dr. Brennan's response is something I'll never forget. He said, "And what did you think you were doing to this one?" I spent 3 weeks in the ICU. My kidneys had gone into acute failure, and I needed emergency dialysis. My liver function was so poor that toxins were building up in my bloodstream, affecting my brain. I had periods of confusion where I didn't know where I was or what was happening. They gave me medications to try to stabilize my organs, to reduce the inflammation, to stop the bleeding. Some of them worked, some didn't. The prognosis was uncertain. My organs might recover partially with time and treatment, or the damage might be permanent. I was 14 years old, and doctors were discussing organ transplant possibilities with my parents. The hospital's social worker and ethics committee got involved. They wanted to know why Child Protective Services hadn't been notified about my participation in so many trials. My parents insisted everything had been legal, that they'd signed consent forms and followed the research protocols. Technically, they were right. There's no law limiting how many clinical trials a child can participate in as long as the parents consent. The system had failed to protect me because the system had never imagined parents would do this to their own child for money. Ethan visited me in the hospital once. He was 15 by then, his hair grown back, looking almost like a normal teenager except for the lingering thinness and the way he tired easily. He sat in the chair next to my bed, not knowing what to say. I could see the guilt on his face, but also the helplessness. Neither of us had chosen this situation. We were both just kids, caught in our parents' desperation and dysfunction. I didn't know it was this bad, he finally said. I knew you were doing trials, but Mom and Dad said it was safe. They said it was helping. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him it wasn't his fault, but I was too angry. Angry at him for being sick. Angry at myself for resenting him. Angry at our parents for putting us both in impossible positions. They lied, I told him. They knew. The doctors told them to stop and they didn't. Ethan started crying. He said he never wanted this, never wanted me to get hurt. He'd begged our parents to stop enrolling me in trials months ago when he noticed I looked sick. They'd told him not to worry about it, that they had everything under control. He'd believed them because what else could he do? When I was finally discharged from the hospital, I came home to a house that felt like a stranger's. My parents were walking on eggshells, being overly solicitous, asking constantly if I needed anything. But there was also resentment simmering under the surface. The hospital bills from my ICU stay were astronomical, and insurance was fighting coverage because my condition was a result of research participation, not a natural illness. The pharmaceutical companies whose trials I'd been in were denying responsibility, claiming my parents had failed to disclose my participation in other concurrent studies. My parents had to hire a lawyer. Uncle Gary, who I hadn't seen in over a year, showed up at our house unannounced. He'd heard about my hospitalization through the family grapevine. When he saw me, thin and yellow with jaundice, dark circles under my eyes from the kidney failure, he lost it. He and my dad got into a screaming match in the driveway that ended with Uncle Gary saying if my parents didn't stop putting me in trials, he'd call CPS himself. My parents did stop, but only because I was too sick to qualify for any trials anymore. My kidney function stabilized at around 40% of normal. My liver was permanently scarred, cirrhotic, despite me never having touched alcohol. I needed daily medications to manage the organ damage, medications that cost hundreds of dollars, even with insurance. The financial irony was crushing. My parents had made well over $400,000 from my trial participation over the years. They'd spent it all on Ethan's treatment and their lifestyle inflation. Now they were facing bankruptcy from my medical bills. The lawyers they'd consulted said they might have a case against some of the pharmaceutical companies for not properly screening me or coordinating care, but litigation would take years, and success wasn't guaranteed. In the meantime, I was 15 years old, on a transplant waiting list, taking 17 pills a day, and unable to participate in normal teenage activities because my body couldn't handle it. School became a nightmare. I'd missed so much time that I was behind in all my classes. The few friends I'd had before had moved on, made new connections I wasn't part of anymore. I looked different, sickly, and teenagers aren't kind about that sort of thing. People asked what was wrong with me. When I tried to explain in vague terms that I'd been sick, they'd ask if it was contagious, if I had cancer like my brother had. I started eating lunch in the library alone, avoiding the cafeteria and its social hierarchies. I no longer had the energy to navigate. The school counselor tried to help, setting up a 504 plan to accommodate my medical needs. But it didn't address the isolation or the grief of losing my childhood to something most people couldn't even comprehend. One teacher, Mr. Lawson, who taught biology, took an interest in me. He'd been a research scientist before becoming a teacher, and when he learned about my situation through my 504 paperwork, he was appalled. He started giving me articles about clinical trial ethics, about exploitation in medical research, about informed consent. He treated me like I was smart enough to understand what had been done to me. That meant more than he knew. Ethan died 3 months after my 15th birthday. His cancer came back for a third time, and his body couldn't take any more treatment. He went from healthy-looking to dead in 6 weeks. It was aggressive, cruel, and unstoppable. I was dealing with my own medical crisis when he got sick again, in and out of the hospital for complications from my kidney failure, so I missed a lot of his final decline. The last conversation we had was on a Wednesday in October. He was in hospice at home by then, too weak to get out of bed. I sat next to him and we played video games, him with the controller resting on his lap, because he didn't have the strength to hold it up. We didn't talk about the trials or about dying. We talked about stupid stuff, like which superhero would win in a fight, and whether the cafeteria pizza at school had gotten worse, or if we'd just gotten older. When I left his room that day, I knew I'd never talk to him again. He died that night in his sleep. He was 15 years old. All the money, all the trials, all the experimental treatments, all of my destroyed organs, none of it had mattered. He died anyway. The grief in our house after Ethan's death was suffocating. My mother locked herself in her bedroom for days at a time. My father threw himself into work, gone from dawn until late at night. I was left alone to process the loss of my brother while simultaneously dealing with the physical consequences of trying to save him. I felt guilty for being alive, guilty for being angry that I'd sacrificed my health for nothing, guilty for sometimes wishing it had been me instead, because at least then my organs would have served their intended purpose. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Reeves, who specialized in medical trauma. She was the first person who validated that what my parents had done to me was abuse. She used that word, abuse, and something in me cracked open. I'd spent years telling myself I was being noble, that I was helping my family, that this was what love looked like. She helped me see that love doesn't destroy. Love doesn't trade one child's well-being for another's. What my parents did was sacrifice me for a chance to save Ethan, and when it didn't work, they were left with one dead son and one permanently damaged son and a mountain of debt. We were all casualties of their desperation. 6 months after Ethan died, the first lawsuit was filed. Not by us, but against us. One of the pharmaceutical companies whose trial I'd participated in was suing my parents for fraud. They claimed my parents had violated the terms of the consent agreement by enrolling me in concurrent trials and failing to disclose my full medical history. They wanted their money back, all $35,000 they'd paid for my participation in the cardiovascular drug trial. My parents countersued, claiming the company had failed to properly screen participants and had negligently allowed a child to be exposed to dangerous cumulative drug effects. The legal battle was ugly and public. Our names appeared in news articles about clinical trial ethics. Medical ethicists wrote op-eds using my case as an example of regulatory failures. I was a cautionary tale, a case study, a statistic. At 16 years old, I'd become the poster child for what's wrong with pediatric research oversight. Uncle Gary became my unexpected advocate during this time. He'd always felt guilty for not intervening sooner, for not pushing harder when he first saw how sick I was getting. He hired his own lawyer to explore whether I could be represented separately from my parents in the pharmaceutical lawsuits. The lawyer, Heather Douglas, was a pit bull in a pantsuit. She took one look at my medical files and the stack of consent forms my parents had signed and saw dollar signs, but also genuine outrage. She explained that while my parents had legal authority to consent to medical treatment on my behalf, including research participation, there were arguments to be made that they'd breached their fiduciary duty as guardians by prioritizing financial gain over my welfare. She wanted to go after not just the pharmaceutical companies, but my parents. She wanted to establish that I was a victim separate from my family, entitled to compensation for the permanent damage done to my body. I was terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. This was my chance to be heard, to have my own voice in what happened next. The litigation exploded into something massive. Heather discovered that I wasn't the only child whose parents had enrolled them in multiple overlapping trials. There were at least 17 other families who'd done similar things, using healthy siblings of sick children to generate income for medical bills. Some of the children had suffered adverse effects. One girl had developed early-onset liver failure and died waiting for a transplant. A boy had severe neurological damage from a trial that tested seizure medications on non-epileptic children. The pharmaceutical companies had known that some families were gaming the system, enrolling kids in multiple facilities to bypass the safeguards. They'd turned a blind eye because pediatric trial recruitment was difficult and expensive. They needed participants, and they didn't ask too many questions about how parents were motivating their children to enroll. Heather filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of all the affected children, with me as the named plaintiff. The case was Daniel Foster versus Meridian Pharmaceuticals and others. The discovery phase of the lawsuit revealed documents that made me physically ill to read. Internal emails from pharmaceutical company executives discussing the cost-benefit analysis of paying families more money versus implementing better screening protocols. Memos acknowledging that some pediatric participants were likely enrolled in concurrent studies, but deciding that proving it wasn't worth the administrative burden. Research coordinator reports noting concerns about repeat participants, but being overruled by higher-ups who needed to meet enrollment targets. One email that went viral when it was leaked to the press came from a Meridian executive who wrote, "If parents are willing to offer up their kids, who are we to say no? We're not the morality police. We're running a business." The public backlash was immediate and severe. Congressional hearings were scheduled. The FDA announced a review of pediatric trial regulations. My face was on the news, my story told and retold. I was 16 years old, and I'd accidentally started a movement. The attention was overwhelming. Reporters camped outside our house. I was asked to speak at rallies and press conferences. Advocacy groups wanted me to be a spokesperson for research ethics reform. I was still a sick kid who could barely make it through a school day without needing to rest, but suddenly I was expected to be an activist, a symbol, a voice for change. Heather helped me navigate it all, coaching me on what to say and what not to say, protecting me from the media circus as much as possible. But there was no protecting me from my parents' reactions. They were furious that I was suing them, that I was airing our family's private decisions in public. My mother accused me of being ungrateful, of forgetting that everything they did was to save Ethan. My father said I was trying to destroy them, that I was ruining their lives. The irony was almost funny. They'd ruined my life, literally destroyed my organs, and they thought I was the one causing harm by seeking accountability. I moved in with Uncle Gary when I was 17. My parents and I weren't speaking. Living in the same house had become untenable. Uncle Gary had a small apartment, just 2 bedrooms, but he cleared out his office to make space for me. He drove me to my medical appointments, reminded me to take my medications, helped me apply for disability benefits because I couldn't work full-time with my health issues. He was the parent I should have had all along. Under his care, my health stabilized as much as it could. My kidney function leveled out at around 35%. Not great, but not getting worse. My liver managed to maintain basic function with the help of medications. I wasn't going to live a normal lifespan or have a normal quality of life, but I could function day to day. I finished high school with homeschooling support because attending regular classes was too much for my body. I took online college courses in medical ethics and public health, finding purpose in understanding the systems that had failed me. The lawsuit took 3 years to work its way through the courts. During that time, more families came forward, more children shared their stories of being used as cash cows for drug trials. The pharmaceutical companies fought hard, arguing that parents had the legal right to consent on their children's behalf and that the companies had followed all FDA regulations. Technically, they were right. The regulations were inadequate, but they'd been followed. Heather's argument was that following inadequate regulations, while knowing they were inadequate, constituted negligence. She brought in expert witnesses, former FDA officials, bioethicists, and medical professionals who testified that the companies had prioritized profit over safety. The jury agreed. When the verdict came down, I was 20 years old. The pharmaceutical companies were found liable for gross negligence and ordered to pay compensatory and punitive damages. My individual settlement was $12 million. The other families in the class action received varying amounts based on the severity of their children's injuries. $12 million couldn't buy me new kidneys or a new liver. It couldn't give me back my childhood or restore my relationship with my parents, but it could ensure I'd never have to worry about affording my medications or medical care. It could fund my education and my future. It could provide financial security that my parents never had, the lack of which had started this whole nightmare. Heather took her contingency fee, and the rest was placed in a structured trust managed by Uncle Gary and an independent trustee. I was set for life, assuming that life wasn't cut short by my failing organs. The settlement also included provisions requiring the pharmaceutical companies to implement new screening protocols, to create registries of trial participants that would prevent concurrent enrollment, and to fund research into the long-term effects of pediatric drug trial participation, real systemic change, the kind that might prevent another kid from being destroyed the way I was. My parents sued for a portion of the settlement, claiming they'd acted in good faith and that some of the money should compensate them for the medical debt they'd incurred on my behalf. The judge denied their claim in a scathing ruling that essentially said they'd forfeited any parental rights to my assets when they'd chosen to exploit me. They declared bankruptcy shortly after and moved out of state. I haven't spoken to them in 6 years. I don't know if I ever will. Part of me understands they were desperate, that they were watching their child die and would have done anything to save him. But understanding doesn't equal forgiveness. They had choices. They could have said no. They could have found other ways. They chose to destroy me to save him, and in the end, they lost us both. That's something they have to live with. I have to live with the physical consequences, but they have to live with the moral ones. I'm 26 now. I've been on the transplant waiting list for 2 years, moving up slowly as my kidney function declines. I might get organs in time, or I might not. I'm trying to build a life in the uncertainty. I finished my degree in public health, and now I work for a non-profit that advocates for research ethics reform. I give talks at medical schools and research conferences about the importance of protecting pediatric trial participants. I help families understand their rights when they're approached about enrolling their children in studies. I make sure no one can ever claim they didn't know the risks, that they didn't understand what cumulative exposure could do. The pharmaceutical companies that harmed me hate that I'm still speaking out, still pushing for stronger regulations. They've tried to silence me with gag order offers, with additional settlement money if I'll just disappear. I refuse. This is my purpose now, the meaning I've extracted from the meaninglessness of what happened to me. I met someone last year, Alexis, a woman who works for a patient advocacy group. She knew my story before we met. Everyone in this field does. But she saw me as more than just a cautionary tale. We started dating slowly, navigating my health issues and my trust issues in equal measure. She comes to my dialysis appointments when my kidney function takes a bad turn. She reminds me to take my evening medications when I'm too exhausted to remember. She doesn't try to fix me or save me. She just loves me as I am, damaged organs and traumatic past and uncertain future. It's the first time I've felt valued for existing, not for what I could provide or what I represented. Uncle Gary likes her. He says she's good for me, that she makes me smile more. He's right. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.